Welcome to Stories Around Us, where every story reflects the world we live in. Today, you'll hear about a woman who didn't shout for justice, she stayed silent, and made an entire system bow its head. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story that might just change the way you see the world. Morning light poured into the cabin as the plane prepared to land at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. Everything had been routine until the sudden sound of rushing footsteps broke the quiet fatigue of a long flight. Two security officers in black uniforms appeared at the rear of the plane. They moved quickly down the aisle, firm and deliberate. When they reached the first-class section, they stopped at seat 3F, where a black woman sat quietly, her head tilted slightly toward the window. She had done nothing. No shouting, no strange behavior. She was simply sitting so calm that the air around her seemed even more tense by contrast. "Ma'am, please come with us," one of the officers said. His voice wasn't loud, but cold and commanding, more like a sentence than a request. The woman turned to look at him. Her gaze was steady, unafraid. Her voice was soft, but clear. Why no one answered? No one from the flight crew spoke up. The flight attendant nearby turned her face away. The co-pilot, who had just stepped out of the cockpit to see what was happening, stood still like a statue. Passengers in business suits and expensive watches looked away, burying their faces in phones or pretending not to notice. No one asked questions. No one stood up. No one spoke. The woman remained composed. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice calm, her dignity intact. Still, the officers moved without hesitation. They unbuckled her seatbelt, lifted her to her feet, and held her by the arm as if she were a security threat. She didn't resist. Her canvas bag slipped from her lap, and when she reached to retrieve it, she was gently but firmly stopped. One officer picked it up, but instead of handing it to her, he set it aside like a misplaced item. Somewhere behind them, a passenger whispered, "She probably sneaked into first class." Another nodded. "Yeah, look at her outfit." In just seconds, a narrative had formed not from facts, but from assumptions, not from behavior, but from the color of her skin and the simplicity of her clothing, a gray coat, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. She was led down the aisle, past the other passengers whose eyes followed her not with concern, but with the detached curiosity people reserve for strangers they've already judged. She had been labeled without question. No one asked her name. No one stood up to help. The silence was not peace. It was complicity. One man near the rear window discreetly pulled out his phone and recorded the moment. Not to defend her, but because this might go viral. He had no idea how right he was. What none of them knew, not the officers, not the flight crew, not the dozens of passive onlookers, was that this woman did not belong somewhere else. She didn't sneak in. She wasn't lost. Her name was Elena Mercer. And by the end of that day, the corporation behind NorthAero Airlines would lose more than $6.3 billion, not because of a safety issue, not because of market turbulence, but because they dragged off the one woman who had the power to stop the largest commercial aviation restructuring in U.S. history. Elena Mercer was not an ordinary woman, but what set her apart wasn't something visible. It wasn't the light gray coat she wore, or the spotless white sneakers on her feet. It wasn't the plain canvas tote bag she carried, or even her calm demeanor that made her seem oddly composed, as if every moment had been anticipated. What made Elena different was something no one could see: power. A kind of power that didn't announce itself, that didn't demand attention. The kind of power that didn't need to be recognized because it existed to observe how others behaved when they believed no one important was watching. Before she boarded NorthAero Flight 1163 that morning, Elena had spent more than 2 years working quietly within the United States Financial Oversight Commission, UFOC, an independent agency empowered by Congress to supervise major investment flows, audit large corporations, and evaluate ethical compliance in merger deals over $5 billion. Within elite financial circles, the name Elena Mercer was not unfamiliar, but she never appeared in the press. She had no public social media. She gave no interviews. She didn't attend high-profile summits. Fame was never her goal. Her mission was to drive real change, from within the systems people believed were too big to be challenged, and the system she was examining now was NorthAero Airlines. 2 months earlier, the UFOC had received an internal tip from a major anonymous investor, accusing NorthAero of harboring a hidden culture of discriminatory service, especially targeting passengers of color, women, and those who didn't fit a wealthy, upper-class image. Publicly, their policies promised equity for all, but internally, employees were reportedly trained to assess which customers deserved priority and which ones were just taking up space. Elena was assigned to conduct a covert audit, traveling undercover as an ordinary first-class passenger to observe and document the full service experience, from the boarding gate to landing. That morning, Elena left her hotel at 5:45 a.m. No security escort, no assistant. Just her and a simple tote bag, containing a sealed envelope, a secure encrypted tablet, and an identification badge that could immediately verify her identity through a national registry, but only to be used if things went too far. She arrived at Gate B-17 at 6:10 a.m. Around her, other first-class passengers were gathering. Some were chatting about business meetings, others sipped coffee from the lounge. Elena blended in effortlessly. That was the goal. She had mastered the art of becoming invisible to systems that weren't built to welcome people like her. When it was her turn, she handed over her phone for scanning. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman, paused. She looked Elena over from head to toe, then asked quietly, "First class. Are you sure?" Elena didn't flinch. "Seat 3F. The scanner beeped green valid, but the agent glanced toward her supervisor before giving a tight nod and reluctantly waving Elena through. That small moment would later prove to be the spark that ignited everything. As Elena walked down the jet bridge, she overheard the agent whispering into her headset, "Confirmed, flagged under code 19C. She knew exactly what that meant, an internal designation for passengers who might not belong in first class. She kept walking, unfazed. She took her seat at 3F. The man beside her, a suited businessman opening his laptop, gave her a brief nod. No one noticed the envelope resting silently inside her tote, or the way her eyes calmly scanned every move made by the cabin crew. She didn't need to speak. She only needed to observe and wait to see how the system would treat her once it decided she didn't deserve to be there. And the system responded exactly as it had been conditioned to, with silence, with exclusion, and eventually, with humiliation. Elena sat quietly in seat 3F, the window seat in NorthAero's first-class cabin. Beside her, a silver-haired man in a navy suit was busy typing on his laptop. He didn't greet her, didn't look her way, not out of rudeness, but because someone like Elena simply didn't fit his expectation of a first-class passenger. Her canvas tote was tucked neatly under the seat in front. Inside it, the sealed envelope remained securely in place, something she held onto with deliberate care. as if even its weight carried a purpose. Elena leaned slightly to observe her surroundings. Her gaze was subtle but intentional, capturing every detail without drawing attention. It was 6:30 a.m. Passengers were still settling in. A flight attendant passed down the aisle offering pre-departure drinks, orange juice, coffee, champagne. When she reached the row in front of Elena, she paused and smiled warmly, offering each passenger their choice. But when she came to Elena's seat, she walked past. No offer, no eye contact, no smile. Elena said nothing. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask why. Because she wasn't there to demand service. She was there to see who was freely offered it and who was silently skipped. A few minutes later, another flight attendant moved through the cabin distributing hot towels. Again. She stopped at the rows ahead, delivering each towel with courtesy and precision. But when she approached Elena's row, she paused, glanced up briefly, then continued walking. Not because they ran out of towels, but because, in her eyes, Elena didn't match the profile of someone who should receive one. The man in 3E accepted his towel without noticing. Elena watched the flight attendant's face expressionless, efficient, and disturbingly automatic. Every move seemed pre-programmed. Exclude, but subtly, without drawing attention. As the cabin doors closed, the lead flight attendant, Camilla Reeves, made her final walkthrough. When she reached Elena's seat, she looked down at the seatback screen, then lingered for a beat longer than usual. Their eyes met briefly. Camilla's glance sent a clear, silent message. I see you, and I'm not sure you belong here. About 35 minutes into the flight, the fasten seatbelt sign lit up in response to light turbulence. Most passengers remained seated. Elena, quiet and composed, rose from her seat and headed to the lavatory. On her way back, she passed through the mid-cabin section, where a few passengers were dozing off. As she re-entered first class, Camilla's eyes locked onto her with sharp awareness. No smile, no warmth, just scrutiny. The moment Elena sat down, Camilla approached. Ma'am, we ask that you remain seated for the rest of the flight. Elena looked up, calmly. I only went to the restroom. Is there a problem? Camilla's tone softened slightly, but remained cold. We've received a few concerns about movement during secure phases of the flight. And your demeanor. My demeanor? Let's just say, some passengers are uncomfortable. Elena didn't reply immediately. She held Camilla's gaze for a long second, weighing whether to respond or remain silent. Then, she turned her face back toward the window. Her hand gently gripped the handle of her tote bag. She knew what this was. A line had just been crossed. No one on that flight knew that their actions, every glance, every omission were being logged, silently, by the very person with the power to determine their future. No one knew that Elena was not just a black woman in a hoodie. She was the person with authority to halt the multi-billion-dollar financial merger they had spent years preparing. She hadn't come to provoke. She came to observe. And within just 1 hour, the behavior she'd witnessed confirmed everything the internal report had suspected. Discrimination no longer lived in policy, it lived in behavior. No one shouted at her. No one made an official denial. But they denied her through silence, through looks, through the deliberate act of passing her by. And that, to Elena, was far more dangerous than any overt rejection. About an hour after takeoff, the lighting in the first-class cabin dimmed gently to allow passengers to rest. Some reclined their seats, others pulled thin blankets over themselves. Elena remained upright, eyes open. She wasn't sleeping. She couldn't not, when everything she was witnessing pointed to something deeper than individual behavior. What she was observing was systemic reflex. When the fasten seatbelt sign lit up again due to a minor alert from the cockpit, a brief announcement asked all passengers to remain seated. Elena, already in her seat, calmly adjusted her seatbelt and looked around. But then something unusual happened. 2 flight attendants, one of them. Camilla stood quietly near the galley at the back of the first-class cabin, speaking in low tones. One nodded. The other tapped quickly on the cabin service tablet, eyes flicking up toward Elena. Moments later, Camilla returned. Her face was no longer pleasant or performative. She stood upright, holding a tablet in her hand, and said, "Ms. Mercer, we've just received a notice from ground operations. There appears to be a discrepancy with your ticket." Elena looked up. "What kind of discrepancy?" "It seems your booking code matches an internal promotional class used for airline staff, but we couldn't verify your employment in our personnel records." Elena frowned. "My seat was booked and confirmed as first class. It was scanned at the gate. I can show you the confirmation email if needed." Camila hesitated for just a second, then replied, "We're simply following protocol. Since we can't verify the record at this time, we're required to flag your seat for post-flight review." It wasn't a response. It was a pre-written indictment. Elena understood. She didn't argue, but deep inside, she felt a cold layer rising. They didn't need a valid reason. They only needed a convenient excuse. She wondered if she had been a white man in a tailored suit, would a discrepancy like this have been raised mid-flight? Or would it have quietly resolved itself afterward? The answer was obvious. As the plane began its descent, another announcement came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we kindly ask that all passengers remain seated upon arrival. We have a minor issue to address before general deplaning." No one knew what the minor issue was, but the cabin tension returned instantly. People looked around. Some whispered. Then, as the plane came to a stop and the door cracked open, 2 security officers in dark uniforms stepped inside. They said nothing to the crew. They didn't ask any questions. They walked straight to row 3, turned to Elena, and stood still. "Ms. Mercer, please come with us," one of them said, not harshly, but without any room for refusal. Elena didn't say a word. She gathered her tote bag and adjusted her coat. As she stood, her eyes passed over Camilla, who was now frozen by the aircraft door. Her face pale. That look wasn't angry. It was still, and in its stillness, more damning than any protest could ever be. Passengers watched Elena as she walked past some recording, others avoiding her entirely. The man in seat 3E turned his face toward the window, pretending to fiddle with his watch. Elena moved down the aisle as if she were inspecting the structure of power itself, a space where respect wasn't given by rule, but by assumption. None of them, not one, realized that the woman being escorted off the plane was the very person who could freeze a $6.3 billion investment deal with a single swipe of her tablet. No one knew that with one quiet press of her fingertip, the futures of thousands could be redirected. And all of it began because of a vague excuse and a string of behaviors they believed no one important would notice. The metallic door shut behind Elena with a heavy click. The corridor leading from the plane into NorthAero's internal processing wing was so quiet that her footsteps echoed along the cold tile floor. The 2 security officers walked ahead of her in silence. They didn't cuff her. They didn't hold her arms. But the atmosphere around her felt like a sentence, one not written in law, but in assumption. They led her into a small, gray room with no windows. Inside, there was a metal desk, 2 hard plastic chairs, and a blinking red security camera mounted in the corner. A few minutes later, a man entered, middle-aged, buzzed hair, worn-out suit. He tried to appear composed, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. "I'm Mark Dalton, guest conduct liaison at NorthAero," he began, extending his hand. Elena didn't take it. "We just need to clarify a few things. There seems to have been a mix-up in your record." Elena remained still, her hands resting calmly on the table. "And you believe that kind of mix-up warrants dragging a passenger off the plane in front of hundreds of people?" Mark didn't respond. Elena slowly unzipped her tote and pulled out a slim, black leather wallet. She opened it and slid a metal card across the table. Mark glanced down. His eyes landed on the embossed lettering, United States Financial Oversight Commission, Executive Auditor. In the corner, an official federal verification code and encrypted seal glinted under the overhead light. My seat wasn't a promotional voucher. It wasn't a mistake. It was a live audit assignment, she said, her voice low, each word like the drop of a hammer. Mark swallowed hard. I didn't know. We weren't told. Staff aren't given access to clearance data like this." Elena's gaze didn't waver. "That's exactly the problem. Not that you didn't know who I was, but that you believed I couldn't be anyone." Outside that small room, the alarm had already been triggered. Less than 15 minutes after Elena had been removed from the plane, an urgent chain of messages flooded NorthAero's internal channels. Immediate personnel report requested for Flight 1163. Retrieve all booking logs. Critical advisory passenger linked to UFOC audit. On the 27th floor of NorthAero's headquarters in downtown Chicago, a senior leadership meeting had just begun when the news hit. A shaken assistant rushed in, holding a printout. "The woman removed from this morning's flight? She's the final approver on our pending investment deal with the U.S. Financial Oversight Commission." Simultaneously, the internal communications team received an alert. A video of Elena's removal was already circulating on social media. In the footage, she made no scene. She didn't yell. She didn't resist. She simply stood, calmly collected her things, and walked dignity intact, face unreadable. And it was that silence, that composure that struck deeper than any outburst ever could. Back in the small room, Mark received a call. His face paled as he listened. He stood up, nodded silently, and turned back to Elena, who hadn't moved, her hand resting on the still sealed envelope. "We'll issue a formal apology, Ms. Mercer. The situation was mishandled, grossly mishandled. We'd like to offer compensation, VIP status, access to private lounges." Elena cut in. "I'm not here for perks. I'm here so you remember that look on your face that moment you realized you treated someone like they were disposable, only to learn they held your entire future in their hands." Mark lowered his gaze. "You didn't fail because I'm an auditor," she added. "You failed because you assumed I was nobody." 9:13 A high-priority message flashed through NorthAero's internal communication system. "Immediate request: retrieve all service logs from Flight 1163. Identify all personnel involved. Priority level R1, special internal audit." 2 minutes later, a second email appeared, this one encrypted, from the United States Financial Oversight Commission, UFOC temporary freeze on $6.3 billion restructuring agreement with NorthAero. Reason: reassessment of internal cultural integrity required before capital release. At NorthAero's headquarters in downtown Chicago, the conference room on the 27th floor descended into chaos. Angela Kim, Director of Risk Analysis, was replaying security footage from Gate B-17. On the screen, a clear image of Elena Mercer appeared, neat, composed, scanning her ticket without hesitation. No disorder, no misstep. Just a black woman with a calm gaze, as if she already knew what was about to happen. No resistance, no incident, Angela said evenly, though her face was tight. And now she's the one holding the final signature on the largest funding deal this company has ever pursued. Across the table, Joel Berkowitz, VP of Strategy, dropped his head into his hands. We've walked ourselves into a firestorm, and we lit the match. The door burst open. Harold Vance, Senior Legal Counsel, entered with a thick folder labeled UFOC, Audit Phase 3. She's not just another compliance field agent, Harold said bluntly. Elena Mercer is a direct appointee of the UFOC's internal board. Her name appears on the clause that can authorize or block the equity transition. The air thickened, and he paused, just dragged her off a plane, on video, while failing to verify her identity. Joel exhaled sharply. Why didn't she say something? Why not reveal who she was? Harold replied without hesitation. Because she wasn't there to be recognized. She was there to see who would treat her like she didn't matter. And now, we know exactly who. Meanwhile, downstairs, the flight crew of Flight 1163 was being pulled into closed-door meetings one by one. Camilla Reeves, the lead flight attendant, sat rigid across from three people, the head of HR, a compliance officer, and the director of flight operations. On the screen behind them, the footage looped Camilla walking past Elena's row without offering a towel, ignoring her during service, skipping her when handing out drinks. We've reviewed the footage, said Charles Lang, director of flight operations, his voice sharp. This wasn't one mistake. It was a consistent pattern of exclusion. Camilla tried to steady her voice. I didn't know who she was. I was following the manifest. Exactly, said Miriam Gaines. HR. The issue isn't that you didn't know her. The issue is that you acted on bias, not procedure. At the employee hub, Trent Maxwell, the gate agent from B-17, sat staring blankly at his login screen. His ID badge had failed twice in a row. You're needed upstairs, a manager said quietly. Bring your shift records. Upstairs meant interrogation. Shift records meant scrutiny. Trent didn't ask. He just stood up and walked, already knowing the gears had started turning and couldn't be stopped. Meanwhile, at the top floor of the building, NorthAero CEO Trevor Lane received a grim update the investment group was considering pulling the deal entirely. A direct call from Washington confirmed it. The situation is beyond containment. Without a public apology and clear action, the financial proceedings will be terminated. Elena hadn't said a word. But she didn't need to. The system was exposing itself every choice, every look, every skipped action. The reckoning had begun. On the top floor of the airport, in the private VIP lounge reserved for elite clients and executives. The silence was thick. The only sound was the quiet clicking of a receptionist's mouse. Elena sat alone in a frosted glass suite, her back straight against a leather chair, her hands resting gently on her familiar canvas tote. In front of her, an encrypted tablet displayed the secure interface of the United States Financial Oversight Commission, UFOC. She had logged in with her fingerprint and was now reviewing the entire timeline of the NorthAero incident. From the moment her ticket was flagged as suspicious at 7:53 a.m. to when she was removed from the aircraft at 8:24, every event had been recorded automatically. Nothing missed. Outside the suite, Trevor Lane, CEO of NorthAero, waited with visible tension. When he entered, he offered a handshake. Elena didn't take it. She simply looked him in the eye, not with anger, but with something more powerful, calm. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Trevor began. "I want to offer, on behalf of our entire executive team, our deepest apologies for what happened." Elena didn't answer right away. She slid the tablet aside, then said slowly, "I assume you're not just here to apologize?" Trevor nodded. "We'd like to understand what it will take to repair the damage. We realize this has spiraled beyond a simple misunderstanding, but our company wants to prove that it can make this right." Elena folded her arms, eyes steady. "The problem isn't that you made a mistake with me. The problem is that you built a system that assumed I couldn't possibly matter." Trevor stayed quiet. Elena continued, "And when that system responded exactly as it was designed to, with coldness, exclusion, no verification, it didn't just damage me. It exposed the core of your institution." "What do you want?" Trevor asked. Elena reopened the tablet and tapped a button. A document appeared on the screen titled Passenger Service System Reform, Level 1. It outlined 5 key requirements: annual implicit bias training for all frontline personnel, from gate agents to cabin crew, mandatory and tracked; quarterly public equity scoring, based on service inclusion metrics, with structured incentives and consequences; performance evaluations tied to behavior-based metrics for all mid-level and senior managers, measuring not just task efficiency, but ethical conduct; integration of an independent external compliance monitor, removing internal HR from sole oversight; a public acknowledgement of the NorthAero incident, not a press release, but a live statement from the CEO, addressed directly to the press and shareholders. Trevor looked at the document, visibly stunned. "You want a cultural overhaul?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "No," Elena replied. "I want a new standard, and if we can't fulfill all of this," Elena held his gaze, "then I'll trigger the investment freeze clause. Not out of revenge, but because I cannot let billions in public funding be placed into the hands of a system that refuses to learn how to value people beyond their appearance." Trevor slowly nodded. His face changed, less defensive, more aware. "We'll make it happen." "No," Elena said. "You'll acknowledge that you hadn't made it happen before. Only then can true reform begin." She stood, closed the tablet, and walked toward the door. Behind her, the CEO of a major airline remained frozen, having just received the politest refusal he'd ever heard, and the clearest warning of his career. The 58-second cell phone video began with a shaky angle and soft murmurs from nearby passengers. In the clip, Elena stood up from seat 3F. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't ask why or shout, "Do you know who I am?" She simply gathered her belongings, adjusted the strap on her canvas tote, and followed 2 security officers out of the first-class cabin. Her face was expressionless. The way she looked straight ahead, no lowered gaze, no glance for help, made it impossible to look away. The person who posted the video never expected what would come next. Within hours, it had spread across platforms: Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, Facebook. By noon, it had reached over 6 million views. Comments flooded in. Who gave this airline the right to do this to a woman who did absolutely nothing wrong? She wasn't aggressive at all. Why was she removed? This is racism in its most polite form, and that's what makes it worse. Hashtags climbed the trending lists. Just sat down, Elena Mercer. Silence is power. She didn't even resist. NorthAero exposed. A well-known legal channel posted a breakdown. You don't need more evidence. What happened here is clear-cut bias. This woman was judged not by behavior, but by appearance. On CNN, A calm anchor stated plainly, "Her name is Elena Mercer. She wasn't just a passenger. She's the executive auditor overseeing a $6.3 billion capital deal, and she was treated like a threat simply for not fitting the image of someone who belongs in first class." Inside NorthAero's headquarters, the PR department was in full meltdown. Professionals once praised for crisis management were now speechless in the face of a tidal wave of public outrage. They scrambled to draft a statement. "We are currently reviewing an isolated customer service incident on Flight 1163. But Elena read the statement from her private lounge, still seated, still calm. She gave the faintest smile. It wasn't one of satisfaction. It was the kind that said, "You still don't get it." On NorthAero's internal employee network, a notification appeared, "Alert Level B Culture Review initiated. All personnel involved with Flight 1163 will undergo mandatory conduct evaluations." In a side office of the HR wing, Camilla Reeves, the lead flight attendant, sat quietly. She hadn't been officially suspended, not yet, but she had already been removed from all international routes. She was no longer trusted to represent the airline in any public capacity. No one yelled at her. No one humiliated her. But the silence around her had become a sentence of its own. Just a few doors down, Trent Maxwell, the gate agent from B-17, sat in a separate room, holding a printed log of every action from his shift that morning. He hadn't realized that a slight head tilt, a hesitant first class, and a reluctant nod could help crack open a gaping hole in corporate culture. Across the terminal, an older janitor pushed a cleaning cart past the admin wing. He watched as Camilla walked out pale-faced, her clipboard clutched tightly. She didn't think anyone was watching. He muttered, "But someone was, and now the whole country is." The story had moved beyond NorthAero. It was no longer about one airline. It had become a symbol of what millions had experienced being excluded in silence, being doubted for not fitting a narrow mold. And this time, the person excluded wasn't powerless. She was the one holding the keys to the institution's future. 4:12 p.m. Every major U.S. news network interrupted its regular programming for a sudden, unscheduled live broadcast. On the screen, NorthAero's logo appeared behind a podium, in front of dozens of microphones and cameras. CEO Trevor Lane stepped forward. He had no script in hand, no smile on his face. His suit remained crisp, but his eyes had lost their usual confidence. He took a breath and looked straight into the camera. "Yesterday," he began, "our airline didn't just fail to serve a passenger. We failed to treat a human being with basic dignity. Her name is Elena Mercer. And she was not just a traveler. She was someone directly responsible for evaluating our transparency, ethics, and service culture." He paused, his voice faltered. "And we treated her as if she didn't matter." The press conference lasted just 7 minutes. There were no questions, no explanations, no shifting of blame to procedure or technical error. Just 2 final words, spoken with a quiet tremble. "We're sorry." The screen faded to black. The NorthAero logo disappeared. Inside a quiet lounge at the airport, Elena sat watching the live stream. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She watched until the final second, then gently placed her tablet on the table. Her hand tightened slightly, then released. "Good," she whispered to herself. But not enough. At UFOC headquarters in Washington, the Oversight Board received a recording of the statement. One supervisor commented, "That's the first time I've seen a CEO of a major airline apologize without offering excuses." A colleague nodded. "So, should we lift the financial freeze?" A beat of silence. The senior official answered, "Let's wait. Let's see." if they turn that apology into real action. Meanwhile, across social media, Trevor Lane's apology exploded in reach. Some praised his courage, others called it too late and damage controlled. But there was one thing no one could deny: this was no longer just about one flight. Media outlets began digging deeper. How many Elenas have been quietly excluded without anyone filming it? Have standard procedures become a veil for systemic bias? If Elena hadn't held the signature on $6.3 billion, who would have defended her at NorthAero's internal leadership meeting the next morning? The whiteboard was crowded with bullet points: structural reform, new audit protocols, culture rebuild. But everyone knew none of it mattered more than the trust that had been lost. "We've been forced to look at ourselves," said Angela Kim, Director of Risk, "and the mirror has a name: Elena Mercer." And Elena? She left the airport through a private exit, declined every interview request, made no public statements, posted nothing on social media. Her silence remained the most powerful message of all. Because everyone now understood, a person doesn't have to say a word to bring a system to its knees. A week after the NorthAero incident, no one questioned whether Elena Mercer was important. The question now was, why did the system ever believe she wasn't across the airline industry? A new internal phrase emerged among major carriers: the Mercer Protocol, a set of service benchmarks, response procedures, and training standards inspired by what had happened to her. Not because she demanded it, but because the industry had to acknowledge that sometimes silence reveals more than 1,000 shouts. In a staff training hallway of a different airline, a slide appeared on screen. Not everyone dressed simply is a coach passenger. Not everyone who is quiet is invisible, and not everyone who doesn't resist is powerless. At the bottom of the slide was a caption excerpt from the Elena Mercer case, NorthAero 1163, March that year. And Elena. She continued her work quietly, without notice, without needing the spotlight. She gave no interviews. She wrote no memoir. She signed no film deals. To her, the incident wasn't a personal victory. It was a cross-section of a broken system that needed to be dissected and rebuilt. And she's still doing that one flight, one audit, one corridor at a time, from first-class cabins to VIP lounges, from gate queues to boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions are made. Only now, people know Elena Mercer could be anywhere, and they've begun to act differently. One morning, at Denver International Airport, a young brown-skinned girl stood in line with her mother to check in. The gate agent looked down at her and smiled warmly. "Would you like a window seat?" The mother's eyes welled with emotion. She whispered, "No one's ever asked her that before." The agent gave a soft nod and replied gently, "We've just updated our service policy. It's called Mercer." At a service leadership conference in San Diego, a senior airline executive took the stage and said, "We used to think reform meant changing systems, but now I believe real reform is changing how we see people. And Elena Mercer taught me that not through speeches, but through silence." That afternoon, in another city, Elena boarded a new flight. No one asked her, "Are you sure you're in first class?" No eyes narrowed when she scanned her boarding pass. No one recognized her. But everyone was more attentive, more respectful. They looked a little longer, not to judge, but to understand. And for Elena, that alone was a revolution. As the plane lifted into the air, sunlight poured through the window. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. She wasn't chasing fame. She was searching for a world where people are seen for who they truly are. And now, she knew a storm can begin from a single person sitting quietly. This story doesn't end with a press conference. It doesn't end with a hashtag. It doesn't end with someone getting fired. It ends with a question. How will you treat the next person who seems like just somebody? And if your answer is, I'll treat them like they might be Elena Mercer, then maybe that's where the real beginning starts. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Subscribe to Stories Around Us to explore more real stories that change the way we see the world. And have you ever been the one silenced? Tell us in the comments.